back. This is lesson number 6, Responses to Industrial Revolution and Capitalism. We are, for the most part, up to chapter 4 of the textbook, Responding to Classical Liberalism, which economically is capitalism. And, this is a good chapter, chapter 4. I definitely would encourage you to go back over it. And after doing lesson 6 and after looking at chapter 4, I would hope that in your notes you could create a chart. And the chart should be a list of groups, like the Luddites, like the Chartists, like the utopian socialists and the Marxists. And with each of these groups, I'd like you to make a list as to, what is their concern about classic liberalism? What is their concern? What is their complaint about capitalism? And then what is their solution that they propose? And how are they going to achieve that solution? And if you can create that chart, then it'll go a long way for you in terms of being able to identify ideological perspectives, and that's going to be necessary in multiple choice exams and A1 sources, and also respond to an ideological perspective with regards to the A2 essay. So chapter 4 is one of the big chapters. It's the first big chapter of the textbook. Chapters 1 and 2 were really an intro, and chapter 3 took us on a bit of a history lesson that was a kind of a, not tangential, but definitely a sideways step. Chapter 4 is a key chapter that before the diploma exam, you'll want to go back over chapters 4, 5, and 6 for economics, and chapters 10 and 11 are the key political chapters. So chapter 4 is a big chapter. Definitely don't put that textbook away forever. But we know that the first step of learning this was the textbook. The second step was the Williams social videos. The third step now is my video I'm presenting to you today. And then through the video, I'm going to ask you to do some stuff with the Lesson 6 Google document that I'm sharing with you, that I'm going to be talking next to here. After you do that, we'll meet at a Hangout. And you should be asking questions about this Lesson 6 and about Chapter 4 at the Hangout. And after the Hangout, you should be able to go back and refine what you understand about it. Please keep in mind that summer school, things go by quite quickly. Every day is a week and every week is a month. And therefore, next week is like next month, and we're only 1 week away from the time I'm recording this from the exam. But from the time that you're seeing this, we're only a couple of days away from the unit exam, from the midterm. And each midterm is weighted about the same as a diploma. So high stakes for sure. So let's make sure that you're hanging out with me and asking questions. So, Lesson 6, Responses to Industrial Revolution and Capitalism. After this lesson, you'll be able to understand the many responses to CEL, Classic Economic Liberalism, and the related problems they saw with CEL and their proposed solutions. And we're also going to hopefully be able to see you apply that to A1 and A2 scenarios. So, there's that suggestion about creating a chart. And before you really dive into responses to classic economic liberalism and some of the critiques, you really need to go back and say, okay, what is classical economic liberalism? What is capitalism? So there's a short video here about Adam Smith that I'm going to get you to pause your take through chapter 4 and the lesson, and definitely watch this video, because it's going to give you an understanding as to what is it that people are responding to. So, in essence, Adam Smith is suggesting that the wealth of nations had been artificially held back because of government intervention through the mercantilistic system. Through mercantilism, royal charters were granted to certain individuals, and therefore some were artificially, held away from that market. And Adam Smith believed that if we could have freedom from government regulation, then the marketplace could grow and the wealth of the nation could grow with it. And this principle of freedom from government and freedom to pursue our own self-interest is often referred to as the invisible hand. If our self-interest, if our own greed can drive our economic decisions, then we will make decisions in our best interest as we're trying to not only survive but thrive as economic individuals, and therefore we will bring to the marketplace something of value, a good or a service to barter. And as we bring more goods and services to the marketplace to barter with others, we'll end up, growing the economy in the process. So definitely watch that Adam Smith video. But not everyone agreed that the vision that Adam Smith had about economic individualism was the best way to run an economy. Charlie Chaplin sums it up in this quote here. Greed has poisoned men's souls, has barricaded the world with hate, has goose-stepped us into misery and bloodshed. We have developed speed, but we have shut ourselves in. Machinery that gives abundance has left us in want. Our knowledge has made us cynical, our cleverness hard and unkind. We think too much and feel too little. More than machinery, we need humanity. More than cleverness, we need kindness and gentleness. So that's a rejection of economic individualism. That's a rejection of capitalism in the Industrial Revolution, because it has changed the way we think, and it has changed our souls. That harkens back to that Richard Hooker quote that we looked at last class, and it's looking at the negative paradigm shift towards individualism that the Industrial Revolution has brought forth. So we do have some Google Docs where I have made some summary notes for you. So here's a Google Doc that contains a PowerPoint presentation. And therefore, if you are struggling with Chapter 4 and making your own notes about what the Luddites want and what the utopian socialists want, then definitely you can take a peek at that. But I am going to go over some of the main groups here. There's a 2-minute video on the Luddites. And in summary, the Luddites are a group of individuals that I would label as reactionary. They're reactionary because they would like to re-establish an old order. In their case, an order before machinery had replaced many individuals as a source of labor. And they were using violence, as this photo shows, to try to force society to return back to that glorious past. So for me, they're a good example of reactionaries. Another term that we talked about last class was the idea of robber barons, when we were talking about that division between the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, and the proletariat, the workers. And here we have Milton Friedman coming to the defense of those robber barons and suggesting that the idea of a robber baron is a myth. It's too simple, and that the capitalists should be given credit for the wealth that they're creating. And definitely a good video to watch, especially if you are anticipating a desire of your own to write an essay in defense of capitalism. I know that many people just in this last year have been very critical of Amazon, the company, because of its wealth is about $1 trillion. And one of the responses that the company Amazon has had is that although our company may be worth $1 trillion, we've created, in excess of $1 trillion of wealth that has been enjoyed by others, because Amazon ends up buying and selling products that are created by others, and the products that they are selling are products that are consumed by choice by people, and therefore it is creating some kind of joy in society, would be their defense. We also have the tenement life, the slum life. So slums was something we brought up in the last lesson. And if you can't really picture what life in slums is like, I've included a YouTube video here. It's Jacob Riis's photo essay of the tenements of New York City at the turn of the 20th century. And his exposing of these tenements is an example of that progressive era when people were wanting to see society continue to evolve, and they were challenging the status quo, the pro-capitalist status quo, and suggesting that there needed to be more social equity, more economic equity as well. Others would suggest maybe it was a gilded age, maybe it was a better age, maybe the turn of the 20th century in America was a time of great wealth creation because of capitalism. So these are just some big picture ideas too about setting the stage of the time period. Then if you, after watching the other video about Adam Smith. And after reading chapter 4, if you're still confused about the Chartists, then we have some look at some of the reforms the Chartists ended up inspiring. In the last lesson, we talked about the Sadler Report and a lot of the factory acts that were created after that would be examples of the legacy of the Chartists. Robert Owen is someone that people use a lot on their A2 essays as an example of, here's evidence of what socialism could look like in a community. The textbook does a great job of, summarizing Robert Owen and his attempt at New Lanark. And that's on pages 134 and 135. You can see I highlighted some stuff in mine. Now, Robert Owen ends up performing the role of government in his New Lanark. In the absence of government that was creating, freedom for the people, he ended up taking on that role. So the textbook talks about how he provides, healthcare, how he provides leisure opportunities, how he protects child labor, and therefore ends up doing in New Lanark many of those things that we'll end up expecting government to do by the mid to late 20th century. So he's definitely a pioneer, and that's why New Lanark is seen as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. One of the big guys coming out of chapter 4, and by big guys, I'm not talking about his height, I'm talking about Karl Marx's impact on history, is Karl Marx. And we really do need you to be able to understand Marxism in theory and in practice. That Karl Marx, more so than Owen or the Chartists, will be on your multiple choice test, and it could be the essence of some of your stuff on an A1, A2. So in a nutshell, Karl Marx looked around and he saw exploitation of workers. And he said to himself, eventually these workers are going to have an epiphany. They're going to have an awakening that they're being exploited. And when they have the awakening, they'll break off their chains of oppression and they will unite. And as the workers of one factory unite, they will have the numbers and they will take over the factory. And when workers in one factory take over that means of production, they'll inspire workers in other factories to take over the means of production there. And no doubt this will lead to civil war because the bourgeoisie, they were not going to want to willingly give up, all of that wealth that they've collected. But because now the factory owner or workers have control of the means of production, they'll win the civil war. Once they win the civil war, they'll create a dictatorship of the workers, the proletariat. And through that dictatorship, they're going to need to re-indoctrinate, right? They'll need to create a paradigm shift in the hearts and minds of the people so that they buy into Karl Marx's maxim that we should work from each according to his ability to each according to his need. And that's Karl Marx. So we need to be able to, and again, Marx is well outlined in the textbook. So go through the steps here. Definitely read this over a few times. But it's also summarized in this document for you. His main beliefs, what kind of ideal society he would like to create. And within this, you should see the principles of collectivism, like the abolition of private property and replacing that with public property, getting rid of competition and replacing that with cooperation. Things should be done for the common good, not self-interest. So, Marxism in theory is something we'll come back to when we look at the USSR in greater detail as well. Remember last day we were talking about cholera as being one of those negative consequences of rapid urbanization and a part of that slum life that workers were living in. Here's a cartoon illustrating that court for King Cholera. The idea that the slum life that the workers were condemned to was a life that ended up providing a breeding ground for disease. There's some multiple choice embedded, so you always have some practice with multiple choice. Now we're getting into that idea of progressivism. Henry George is saying, when he goes to New York City, a rising tide doesn't rise all boats. So capitalism, industrial revolution is this rising tide, right? But he's observing that, yeah, you know what? Some people are thriving here, but some are living with cholera. Some are living in slums. So he looks around and says, a rising tide doesn't rise all boats. And therefore, something outside of the economy needs to alleviate that poverty. So we're beginning to look at a changing role with government. Adam Smith wanted freedom from government, classic liberalism. Now people like Henry George are seeing that maybe we need freedom through government. The Chartists are seeing that too, right? That the Chartists were saying, no, we need government to create factory acts, that it's through government legislation that we can deal with and respond to these human rights abuses. So although we won't be using the term modern liberalism until the mid 20th century, the idea of modern liberalism is, instead of freedom from, it's freedom through government. But we're seeing some of the early ideas of modern liberalism in these Chartists and progressives that are seeing a desire to reform liberalism. Not completely abandon liberalism like communists want to do, but progressives are trying to reform it. Henry George has a sign, or sorry, J. Lewis has a sign here, but the sign is promoting Henry George's ideas about how in capitalism people can create wealth by doing nothing. I bought some land for $3,600. I'll sell it at $6,000. Ooh, look at me! I've made money. It's questioning that profit without actually earning it. Now, the irony here is that whoever owned that little plot of land in New York City, if they did sell it for $6,000, they sold it for far too little, because that land's no doubt worth millions today. But should we create wealth by not doing anything other than just holding on to vacant land? Or should wealth be what the laborers are doing in those factories? We need you to know about the progressive era, and we want you to know about the President of the United States during this time, a president named Theodore Roosevelt. So we do have a simple video here about progressivism, a quick video that you can look at, and I've taken some notes too for you. These are actually from another teacher that works in Edmonton, that works much harder than I do, and I'm thankful for his work there. But through these notes, you're going to be able to see that desire to change the relationship with the government, and the desire to achieve that freedom through government. That we need unemployment protection, we need safety regulation, we need government-funded healthcare. And not only that, but society needs to evolve not just economically, but also socially. Women need to have the vote. And even environmental conservation laws. At the turn of the 20th century, this would be an idea that is decades ahead of its time. One of the main things Theodore Roosevelt is remembered for, and it's highlighted in the textbook as well, is Theodore Roosevelt's square deal. So his square deal is some specific history that we do need you to know. It's on page 143 of the textbook here. Again, this chapter is doing an excellent job. And in essence, the square deal is this idea that when labor negotiates with capitalists, they had historically been seen as not equal partners. And Theodore Roosevelt was suggesting that it could be the role of government to help equalize that there needs to be an equal negotiation between capitalists and labor. And therefore, when labor was at a point of unrest, and when they were going on strike, he bucked the historical trend. And instead of sending in troops to defend capitalists, he would send in troops to defend the interests of both. There's a great list of his accomplishments here. And through this list of accomplishments, we can see that progressive idea. He's going to offer the square deal, but he's also trust busting, meaning I can't have any one company, corporation, conglomerate able to control or monopolize an industry. So we need to break up conglomerates that are able to dictate the terms within an industry. So an example might be if one company owned 95% of the oil companies in the world, right? One conglomerate owned 95% of the oil companies in the world, then it's not in the interest of the free market to allow that, because there is no freedom in a market when you only have one seller. You have a monopoly, and therefore that seller is going to artificially inflate prices. So we're going to break up some trusts. We're going to pass things like the Food Health Inspection Act. So there's a disgusting story coming out of Chicago in the meat packing plants, and it's captured by a muckraker named Upton Sinclair, and he captures it in a story called The Jungle. And in Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, he talks about these meat packing plants of Chicago and how mixed in with the meat there'd be like rat feces and rope, and therefore when people are buying the meat coming out of the plant, they had no idea that they were buying rat feces. So stories like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle exposed issues with capitalism and forced the government to take on the role of ensuring public health. That's progressivism. And often Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, and again, that's referenced in the textbook too, so if you're like, I've heard of this somewhere, yeah, you have. You heard of it when you read the textbook. So often students will use Upton Sinclair's The Jungle as some evidence in their A2, in their essay, to show, what role should the government be playing in the economy. So definitely keeping track, doing an inventory of those case studies will help you out. So progressivism is both in chapter 4 and 6. I'm not a real fan of how they outlined the textbook. There's no reason to separate it like that. But in chapter 6, they're talking about the evolution of liberalism, and they do get into some of these progressive ideas, and the issue with Upton Sinclair's The Jungle is on page 198, and they talk about some of the reforms under Roosevelt on page 199 and 200 as well, including that trustbusting. All right. Now, are we going to need to know that he strengthened the U.S. Navy, that he won the Nobel Prize by negotiating an end to the Russo-Japanese War? That's not key to our story of economics and social evolution of America today. As an aside, meaning you don't have to do this for me, but if you're interested, here's a link that compares many U.S. presidents to try to determine who's the greatest. We'll see. See what you think of that. There's some terms here, like industrial paternalism, welfare capitalism, welfare state, statism, that you're going to need for your multiple choice to begin to take that inventory of terms, so that when you see language on your exams, you're not dumbfounded as to what they mean. So we're unpacking the idea of industrial paternalism here, and I use the idea of Henry Ford. Now, Henry Ford is credited in America with help creating the middle class by paying his workers $5 a day at a time when $5 a day was double the wage what they were earning elsewhere. So why would he do that? Well, Henry Ford understands that these workers are also his consumers, and he wants to make sure that they're able to buy his product. But he also sees them as an investment. He knows that it takes weeks to train his workers, and once trained, if they end up leaving and moving on to a different work, then he's going to have to spend money retraining other workers or training other workers. So he needs to have happy workers who are trained, and therefore still creating a much profit for him. Ford wasn't losing money by giving $5 a day to his workers. He was paying them $5 a day so that he could basically buy their loyalty, so that they could become a long-term investment for him. This allows us to jump into the topic of minimum wage. Who should regulate that? Should we leave the regulation of minimum wage to industrialists like Henry Ford? Well, what if not all industrialists share that paternalistic feeling, that paternalistic responsibility that Ford had? What if some industrialists want to pay sweatshop-like wages? What if they want to take advantage of workers and pay them, as we can see in parts of the world today, 25 cents a day to work? Is there an obligation or responsibility for the government to protect those most vulnerable in society, those most marginalized? Is there a responsibility for the government to give dignity to those who cannot negotiate on their own behalf a livable wage? And that was an issue at the turn of the 20th century and is still an issue in 2020. Here in Alberta, we know that there's a separate minimum wage for, people that are under the age of majority, right? Not adults. And even that is controversial. So, what would be a livable wage? How much do people need to make? Should we have legislation created to protect people from being discriminated against in the workplace? It used to be pretty common that you would have signs up in businesses that would say no Irish need apply, because Irish were seen very, very stereotypically as not being dependable. Well, we now have legislation in place in Canada through the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms that we have protection from discrimination in the labor market. That you cannot discriminate based upon ethnicity. But 100 years ago, it was very common. So, here's some assessment for you to practice with. Here's some A1s and A2s. Now, when you work your way through the A1s and A2s, I would be working through them and seeing, can I see a connection between individualism and collectivism? Can I see an ideological perspective? Can I see a problem that is being exposed with regards to the Industrial Revolution? Can I see a problem that is being exposed that there's a solution being offered as well? And that, my friends, is responses to the Industrial Revolution and capitalism.